Hello and welcome to this Moodle video guide on using the lesson tool. Now the lesson, I believe, is one of the most powerful tools within Moodle itself. It is also quite complicated to maybe sort of get your head around, and so please bear with me through this video and I'll try and explain it as best I can and on how to use it. So once we're inside the lesson, you can import questions, add a content, add a cluster, or add a question page. Now, for the purposes of these demonstrations, I'll try and cover off adding content, question and cluster pages themselves, but it's probably easier to start with to show you a live example of one of these lessons in action. So this one here I've developed as a game, kind of a sort of a story that you can interact with. So I'm going to proceed to the story. And as you can see now, I've been presented with a scenario where we've been locked in a room. There's the sort of story that we need to go through, and then I've got two buttons to press. Now, within a lesson tool, these buttons that we're clicking to go through and navigate through the story are actually called jumps, and this will become more apparent in a minute when we come to the creating it. So I'm able to navigate through this particular story following the path. Now, at the moment, it is just text, and the buttons or the jumps that I'm clicking relate to that part of the story. However, you can add images and you could also add videos. So you could work out a particular sort of story that involved some videos that maybe highlight or present a question, which you can then use to navigate through the particular story or scenario that you're running. Now within the edit screen for this, I've got a collapsed view, which is easier to sort of show, but there's also an expanded view, which is the way I used to create it. So as you can see, I've got the page title, what type of page it is, and we can see that these are all content pages, and then the jumps that I mentioned, which are the little green buttons that allowed me to navigate through it. I'm at any point able to add a new page, edit the page that it was on, or delete it. So with this one I had in mind, you can see that actually the path I could take allowed me many different options. So I went from 1 to 2 or maybe to 3. From there, if I went to page 2 first, I could then move on to one of the other options that were available. Now, it's easy to sort of think about this in a linear fashion and work from the top down. The problem is, and I'll explain this and hopefully demonstrate this a little bit more, that doesn't work. So from 2, I could have gone to 4 or 5, or across to 3, back to 1, or any combination by using these jumps. Now the second example I'm going to show you for the lesson tool is a sort of a very linear one, which is creating a workbook. And this workbook that you can see had a content page explaining what I was expected, followed by some question pages. So again, if we look at the edit screen for this, you can see that there are content pages, followed by the sort of questions, the multiple choice, the matching, followed by my content, and then other questions. So this one would work through in a very linear fashion, just asking the questions and the text as it went. Now with this one, they have a menu on the side of the screen. So if I go to the preview again, you'll see that the lesson menu allowed me to navigate through the entire workbook at any pace I liked, whereas the story that we had, I'd turned off that lesson menu option so that I couldn't navigate through to any point. So this one obviously worked in a very linear fashion, just going through each point that I wanted. And you could build this from the beginning to the end without really any worry or any need to think about how it's going to be structured, whereas the last one, you need to think about structure. So before we start creating the lesson, what I'm going to do is go back into the administration, into edit settings, and take us into the settings for the lesson tool. So under appearance, you can see that we can display our progress for the students, and the left menu, which actually we saw appeared on the right in that workbook. Now the maximum number of answers relates to our jump buttons. By default, there are 4 that we can sort of fill in. You can obviously change that and add more, but you can only do this sort of before you start creating things. So it's a very good idea to plan your structure, how many jumps you're going to have at any point, and even if you don't use all 4 or maybe 5 or 6, what you're able to do is have them there ready for you when you need them. You can have it in the flow control. You can also see that you can actually have more than one attempt at the workbook or sort of the lesson in general. What I'm going to do is start by adding a content page, and I'm going to call this content page 1. Now you'll see that I want to jump to, in the content section here, to 2 and 3 that we would have had from that original diagram. Now at the moment those pages haven't been created because I'm creating a sort of a multiple choice story, but from the beginning. And actually what we need to do is first plan it like we had on that image that you saw earlier, and what we do is we retro do it. So you start from the bottom and you work up. Now this is going to become more relevant in a second. So I've chosen the next page for both 2 and 3. So I'd save this first page that I've done. And now I'd need to create my next page. So I'm going to add a new content page in. And this is going to be page number 2. And so the content here would be to pages 4 and 5, or whatever the story might be relevant to. As you can see, where I've got my 4 answers of content 3 and 4, I'm able to add in more options. If I wanted more, I'd need to make sure to add that in that settings menu we saw just a minute ago. Now as you can see, the jumps go to this page, next page, next page, and next page. So when I create page 3, I get the jumps again, and I'd keep completing this. Now the problem is, I now need to go back to page 1 once I've created all of my jumps for the relevant page on number 3 here. I need to go back and edit using the little cog icon under Actions. And I now need to change the jump to be the correct page. So rather than going to the next page, I want to choose it to jump to page number 2 and then page number 3, obviously the correct pages relating to the numbers I'm going to be working through. So if I now do it and go to page 2, it takes me to page 2. However, because I've got these ones set as next page, actually it's going to take me through to page 3. Because as yet we haven't created page 5, but in the linear fashion of the edit screen, it will take me to the next page, which in that order, in that edit screen, is number 3, not number 5. And this is why it is useful to work backwards from the very bottom of a very planned story if you're doing a, like I say, story mode rather than a linear sort of next page option of a workbook. If I'm creating an expanded story, I'd use the expanded view. Initially it looks exactly the same, but I'm going to choose to add a content page. Now at the moment I'm going to start from the bottom and work up. So this is my page 9. I'm going to say that this is the end of the lesson, and the jump I can set to be actually the end of the lesson. So I don't need any content from pages 2, 3 and 4 there, and this is now my bottom page. Although you can see at the top and at the bottom I can import and add pages. However, if I use just that top one the whole time, what it will keep doing is pushing down that last page I've already created to the bottom, as the edit screen is actually linear even if the story itself jumps around from the planning that you do beforehand. So what you can see now is I'm adding the content pages from the top, pushing them down, and because I'm doing it from the bottom upwards, my content, my jumps are already created. So pages 8 and 9 are now already created. So page 9 I can set to be page 9 already, and I just save that when I'm done. So actually it'll save you time if you plan it properly. You'll be able to then work through in the right order to make things appear in the right place. So as you can see, I click page 9 and it takes me to page 9, and I can choose end of lesson. And because I've got the lesson menu just selected, I can now navigate through that as well to any previous point. However, if you're using a story mode, you may not want that menu there, as you may want them to work through that decision-making process and arrive at a sort of a point at the end. Now I can add question pages, and I've got sort of a very sort of select few type of questions, and now I'm going to choose true or false. I'd fill this in, and what I would then be able to do is set my correct response to take me off to a certain page. Now it's probably a good time to highlight that in a lesson tool, unlike a quiz, if you have content pages and question pages, the lesson doesn't know how to grade it. So it will not be able to work it out for you. So the problem we had in some of the workbooks where they had the lesson as the lesson menu option, what happened was the students were able to answer one question, navigate to the end of the lesson and get 100%, even though they hadn't answered all the questions. But because they'd answered one question correctly, they were given 100% of the questions they had answered, because it doesn't know, with the content page in it, how that fits together. So as you can see, what I've done is when you answer the question a certain way, it will then take you off to the next correct page. When using the questions, you can only jump to next page. You can't navigate like we did with the content pages to maybe the correct page that you want it to be. So it has to be, with the quiz side of it, it has to be in a very linear fashion, even if you're trying to get it through a story. Now I'm going to add a cluster in, and what a cluster would allow you to do is group together questions. So I have a start and an end of a cluster, and within that cluster I'm able to add a range of questions which it would then draw from. So it would then maybe pick one of the questions out of a selection of 5 that I would work through in this particular case. And I can get it to jump to any question within that cluster if I want, or just an unseen question within that cluster. If I look back at the workbook that we have as the idea, you see this first page is a content page with a jump just to the next option within that sort of series. I then have the questions because the student was able to go and do the research before answering them. And then there's either return to the introduction or proceed to the workbook questions, or I could use the menu system to navigate through to any other area. I get to the questions and I'm then able to answer them. Now the problem, like I say, was that the students could use that navigation to navigate around the workbook and miss out questions, but answer maybe just one and still get 100%. If you're going to use a workbook in that fashion, you'd probably want to hide the left-hand menu so they have to work through it sequentially. However, you could have it as a revision tool, and that would then allow you the option of them sort of just using the menu to find out bits and pieces and not worry about the final overall grade if you're going to have the graded parts of the question. If it's just content pages, it can't be graded. There is no facility to grade it. You can't tell if a student has completed the questions or at least the path and found out what path they took. It will only work with the questions that are within that. Which is why, again, I mention it's probably a good idea, where possible, to use the quiz tool for actual sort of questioning and assessment areas. This is a very good tool for decision-making processes with maybe a few options within that, which is where you'd use the questions. Looking at this final diagram, you can see that it's rather structured as a tree that would expand outwards, or just a complete linear sort of workbook idea. It has branches from 1 to 2 and 3, as you can see, but it then brings it back to 4, so that 2 and 3 would always have a common sort of next page. And this might be for sort of a more sensitive subject. For instance, if you were doing something to do with paramedics, or maybe to do with their sort of health and safety, if the option that you were leading the student down had the risk of injury or harm that you didn't want the student to have to sort of face or deal with in this particular sort of outing, what you could do is they make the decision, either 2 or 3, and 2 may have been incorrect and 3 may be the correct path. What you're able to do is at the end of that, sort of bring it back to page 4 and list why it was the right or the wrong decision, or from page 2 they may only be able to go back up to 1 to then make the choice to number 3 to go down to 4. So they never have to actually hit a real conflict. They're just explained why their decision was wrong and why they may need to make a different choice and maybe highlight the consequences that could happen, but without having to have them go through that decision-making process. They're then able to work through the lesson from all the way down without ever branching too far out, but just keeping it nicely within, as you see, sort of a decision-making process, but one that doesn't stray too far. Thank you very much for watching this particular Moodle video on the lesson tool. As I say, it is quite a complex tool, and if you wish to have any assistance, please email elearn@port.ac.uk or contact your local faculty OCD or online course developer, who should be able to help you plan and implement this particular tool.